I've been studying art history for about 5 years, first in the US and currently in Berlin. As a student, I've attended university lectures, read books and catalog texts and articles written by scholars. I have visited art museums. These sorts of authorities have often left me with the impression that art history has, through the sheer power of its judicious and personal analysis, wrested all the art of all of history between its arms and has compressed them into chapters that seem to march forward through time, much like these stone pillars. The most frequent and, I think, consequential way that art history is mediated involves whittling down the vast number of artworks made by humankind and categorizing them into periods and movements. These periods and movements are represented by artworks that through time and consensus have become canonical. When transmitted in this way, the transition from one chapter to the next seems almost inevitable. There's the really ancient stuff like prehistoric rock art, then we skip forward to ancient Greek and Roman art. Then comes medieval art, the Renaissance, the Baroque, Rococo, Romanticism, Impressionism, Modernism, Postmodernism, and finally, with contemporary art, we've made it to the present, nearly. Critics have rightly pointed out that this widely taught account is focused on the West, concentrates on white and male creators, and leaves artistic contributions of many peoples and places unexamined. Still, by and large, this telling of art history holds strong. Its coherence makes it powerful, and so does the fact that it's repeated over and over again. In the end, it can be difficult not to be left with an impression of this art historical account as an ossified, stony, impenetrable thing. Once in a while, we're reminded that the narratives that constitute art history aren't unassailable or unshakable. This happened to me when I encountered the work of the American artist Mequitta Ahuja. Ahuja paints self-portraits that layer gestures of representation drawn from the Western painting tradition. Because Ahuja is depicting her own likeness in paintings that also incorporate recognizable elements from historical paintings, her works end up being highly personal and self-referential on one hand, and on the other hand are engaging in a conversation about belonging with the Western art historical canon. I'd like to dig deeper into how Ahuja's paintings enact a strategy of decolonial aesthetics. By this I mean, how do they chip away at the false sense of universalism conveyed by an art history that has, in actuality, largely been developed out of Western, white, male, and Christian perspectives? Ahuja was born in 1976 to an African-American mother and an Indian father, and was raised on the East Coast. Her early work consisted of drawings, collages, and paintings in which she experimented with how identity is pieced together and the agency involved in that process. She called these works automythographies. In recent years, Ahuja has moved away from focusing directly on identity in her work. She has written that, as a female artist of color, I have internalized the expectation that I should mine my personal experiences as case studies in the social conditions of race, class, and gender. In saying this, Ahuja is highlighting how artists with identity markers that diverge from those of the hegemony are, too often, expected to feature these aspects of their identity in their work. Of the expectation that she mine her experiences and social condition in her practice, Ahuja writes, I both accept and step beyond that expectation. I aim to hold and to embody in my work both politics of identity as well as the function of self-portraiture exemplified by Poussin's 1650 self-portrait, displaying authority within the history and discipline of painting. So Ahuja sets out on the path of including identity in her work while simultaneously transcending that expectation by pursuing something beyond it, mastery over her medium. In one of her paintings, titled Close Quote, we see Ahuja's likeness caught in the act of covering or uncovering a painted canvas that's on its side. Here, Ahuja is essentially straddling three roles. In the painting within the painting, she's a posing seated model. As the figure dressed in blue, she embodies agency in her role as an artist. She has made the painting within the painting come into being. Perhaps she is unveiling it for a viewer, maybe she has just sold it. And then on the third level, we know that it's the living, breathing artist, Mequitta Ahuja, who created and conceived of this multiplication of herself. This painting shows Ahuja's subjectivity to be multidimensional. In addition, Close Quote positions her work as a continuation of a longer art historical tradition. Take the ultramarine-colored cloth that features prominently in the composition. From classical art onwards, drapery, ranging from the diaphanous to the sumptuous, has played a key role as a decorative element, framing device, and signifier of wealth. So is the color ultramarine blue, a pigment that was once made by grinding costly lapis lazuli and has been used by artists from Michelangelo to Vermeer. In another painting, titled Expect, Ahuja mounts what's perhaps her strongest critique of the Canon. Here, she paints herself lying upon an ultramarine drapery while pregnant in a pose evocative of reclining female nudes like Manet's Olympia and Titian's Venus of Urbino, right down to the crossing of the ankles. On the wall, behind the reclining Ahuja, hangs a painting that clearly references the proto-cubist Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Picasso's 1907 rendering of Spanish prostitutes, with faces inspired by Iberian sculpture and African masks he encountered in Paris. The art historian Carol Duncan has identified Demoiselle as one of the clearest products of the virility and domination that marked early 20th century male artists' rendering of women. Duncan writes that in Demoiselle, Picasso manages to conjure a fantastical and contradictory image of woman as whore and deity, decadent and savage, tempting and repelling, awesome and obscene, looming and crouching, masked and naked, threatening and powerless. Ahuja responds to these tropes in a way that disrupts their exoticizing and sexualizing effects. Her painting appears to have sucked the pink and blue tones from Picasso's original Demoiselle, signaling a transfer of authority from Picasso's work to her own. Furthermore, Ahuja has explained that Expect is a visual account of her challenging process of conceiving in real life. The ultimately celebratory outcome is embodied in Ahuja's figure in the foreground, who proudly holds up an ultrasound image for us to see in her left hand. The struggle that led up to her pregnancy is represented within her grayscale reimagining of Picasso's Demoiselle. In her reimagined version, Picasso's beastly femme fatales are replaced by women, possibly even versions of Ahuja, who reflect the range of emotions that Ahuja underwent as she tried to conceive. Ahuja's projection of affect upon the space in the canon that's occupied by Les Demoiselles d'Avignon emphasizes through contrast just how dehumanizing Picasso's imaging of women is. At the same time, her insertion of an experience marked by both extreme pain and joy very productively works to articulate a story of female affect that is largely absent from the art historical canon. I find it difficult to believe that Ahuja would absorb so much imagery from canonical artworks without harboring a deep appreciation for what these old paintings managed to achieve. So while her self-portraits are critical and subversive, I also think of them as love letters dedicated to a rich oil painting tradition that spans centuries. As an artist who's also a woman of color, she is contesting the institution of art, how and by whom art has been produced, how and what and whom art discourse has or hasn't valued and validated. But she is also embracing the beauty, representational possibilities, and the technical accomplishments that have come out of that same institution. Ahuja is staking her strategy on what the cultural theorist Stuart Hall would call contesting a dominant regime of representation. She is contesting the regime of art history from within. She is adopting the language of the canon to carve out space for herself and others within it. Her approach is a hopeful one because it recognizes art history to be fluid and changeable, and sees that it can be expanded to be more open to more people.